Hi everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. It's hard to believe that summer's almost over and school will be here in just a few weeks. But fortunately, I've got just the thing for you this week that'll help to ease your kids, teachers, and even you back into the school spirit. And those would be my School Rules Dynamic Duos sets. I especially love these sets because each one, there are two of them that work together, come with 6 or 7 different pieces which allow you even more design flexibility than typical. I'm going to talk about how to use the first set alone, which is the background set that also has some foreground elements. Then I'm going to show you how to use that background set in conjunction with the message and frame set so that you can personalize these cookies with messages, of course. And then last but not least, I'm also going to demonstrate that stencils needn't be used just in the classic way, either airbrushing through them or spreading royal icing over them. They can often be used as guidelines for other techniques, so I'm going to use them as guidelines to create dimensional royal icing transfers to go on top, and also as guidelines for dusting additional color into the cookies. So let's get started and talk about what we need for this project. So what you'll need, at least one iced cookie. I am starting in white and the icing needs to be dry all the way through. The flatter the better because we're going to be stenciling on top. If there's any bumpiness to it, it's harder to stencil without some spray or icing going underneath. You might want a couple or more, of course, if you're serving more people. You'll need then my Julia Usher School Rules Dynamic Duo set. It's sold on the Confection Couture website, and I'll have the link in the video description below. That consists of 2 sets. The first is the background set. The background here is a stack of books and it's got some other elements which I'll show in more detail later. A globe, apple, and a jar of pencils that can be superimposed on top. And then you'll need the second duo set as well, which is the message and frame set. It has 4 different messages and frames that could be used in lieu of some of these foreground elements or in addition to them to create an even more layered look with the stencil design. Now to stencil, to hold the stencils in place, it's awesome to have a stencil genie, this little magnetized frame. In addition, I sometimes weight my masking pieces with small magnets. The corners of the genie I sometimes weight further with wood blocks. In this case, some of my masks are really tiny. I couldn't avoid it. I like them to generally be no smaller than my magnet weights, but they're pretty tiny, the little apples that go on top. So I'm going to need some blue painter's tape to stick them down. And of course you need something to airbrush with, and I'm using my new Julia airbrush, which comes either individually by itself or as part of a system with my on-demand air compressor, which is actually sitting on the floor because that's where I like to work with it. Once we're done stenciling that might be enough, but you might want to go more, as I'm prone to do, and add additional color and dimension, and that's where these compressed petal dust kits come in. They're going to be used to dust, dry dust with a dry brush onto the background to create just some suggestions of color. So I've got airbrush colors, of course, that I need, and I'll be working with 5, I believe, in this video. Brown, a red for the apples, a mixture of greens for the apple leaves, and a little bit of blue to give it some accents. I've got black in here, but I don't think I'm going to be working with that, but we'll see. And then lastly, I'm going to be talking about how to create these dimensional transfers that are also stenciled using my particular sets. Little apples, and also globes. These are completely optional, but they do add that bit of extra dimension and aha factor to these cookies. Okay, so let's get started with talking about how to use just the background foreground set all by itself. Here's the background piece itself, which is the stack of books, a couple of jars of pencils and rulers, and 1 apple. You also have 3 additional masking pieces, one that takes the shape of another jar, which could be placed anywhere to leave an area for a jar to be stenciled on top later. Likewise, you've got a globe. I tend to love to put it right on top of that stack of books. And you've got this other small apple, which could be placed anywhere. I've got 2 sets, so sometimes I put 2 apples in addition here. It's a small piece, and this is the piece I often tape down with a little blue painter's tape, but I might not even use it. I might just do a globe here because the background has a lot going on with it already. So that covers 4 of the 6 pieces. Then we've got the shading stencil, which is just the negative piece left over after the masks are cut out of that. And I often use that to create shadows around some of the pieces, so I'll definitely be using the globe shading stencil piece to create a kind of a halo of blue around it to really set it off from the rest of the background. And then lastly, you've got the foreground stencil itself, which contains all the detail. these are the elements that are going to fill in those areas we masked off and left spaces for. So you've got the globe, the small apple, and the pencil jar. So I'm just going to do a simple one, I think, with the globe on it, show you how that works. And for this, I need to put my background stencil in the Stencil Genie. Now first situate the background stencil where you want it. I want it slightly off to the left so I have room for the globe on top of the stack of books. You can either tape down the masking piece or weight it down with small magnets, or both. You really only need to do one or the other though here. I've got some low parts now in the center of my cookie, so I'm going to additionally have to press those areas down with my trussing needle as I spray around them, otherwise I'll get underspray. I'm going to start with the lightest color first, the red. It's looking a little speckly, which is an indication that my airflow regulator might be too low, but I'll correct that later. First I want to give a little more spray to the right-hand side to create a shadow. Now let's adjust that airflow regulator. It really needs to be open about a quarter turn from my closed position to get a smooth, even spray like you see for the green. Now onto the darkest color, the brown. Along these long areas of the books, I like to spray lengthwise, not across them, but rather along their length. That way I get much less underspray. So let's see what it looks like. It may be a little darker than I wanted. If I wanted a more neutral background or one that was less in our face, I could have mixed my brown with white food coloring. Or gone over it less lightly, but I wanted more of an even tone, so I went over it a few times. Ta-da, that looks great. And so I've got a nice little halo left for the globe. So my next step is to actually create a shadow around that. And I do that with the shading stencil, about so. I don't put it in the frame because it's off to one side, so I will need to weight it down. I will need to use one of my masking pieces to also keep it in place. For shading, as a reminder, I like to work at a distance from the cookie because I just want a suggestion of color on the cookie. That looks great. I'm going to do some similar shading around the edges. Shading in this way is a nice way to frame the cookie. Sometimes you can get away without doing a pipe border just by doing a shading effect like this. Now back to detail work. We're going to put the finer points onto the globe. Again, I want to mask off the exposed area of the cookie with my quadrant masking tool and weight it all down. Now for close range work, as a reminder, I work at a 90-degree angle to the cookie with light pullback on the trigger and also low airflow through the airbrush. If I have either too much airflow or too much pullback on the trigger, I'll get an overaccumulation of coloring on top of the stencil that'll go underneath. But that looks great. It does need a touch more color, however, so I'm going to add splashes of green using the same shading technique, again working at a distance. I'm hitting the globe around the apple leaf and also around the edges, and I think that looks terrific. Okay, so I added some coloring through airbrushing, but I'm going to do a little bit more because there's still quite a lot of brown there. I want to break up some of the brown and white with some color and also add a little bit of color to the jars. But I'm going to do that with a dusting technique just to show you yet another way that stencils can be used. I'm going to do that a bit later. First, I want to show you how to pair this background set with my message and frame set to get even more design possibilities. So now let's talk about the message and frame set. I'm going to combine it with the background set, but let's talk first about what's in it in the order in which I generally use them. Let's start first with the 4 masking pieces. These are the little blocking pieces that are going to leave an area for the message. And I've got 4 in this set, which, as I said, is a larger than usual number, an apple and a couple of other ones. You'll notice that some of them can be oriented in different ways and still fit our messages, so you needn't stick with them in the configuration they're cut out on the stencil. The next piece that I typically use is the shading stencil to create some shadow around the message. This is completely optional. You don't need to use it, but I often like to highlight the message that way. And this is just the negative piece that's left over after cutting out these masking pieces. Then I like to lay in the frame by centering it into the shadow that I just created. And again, you've got 4 options that fit exactly those masks, and then messages will fit a combination of the frames typically. So I'm going to do a cookie very similar to what I did last time with just the globe on it, but I'm going to add a message off to the side. And in order to add the message off to the side, I need to move the globe over a little bit. I'm using the same dirty stencil I used before. I don't really need to clean it as long as it's dry and there's nothing on the back side until I can't really see through it. And it's still acceptable. Though to fit a message, I think I want a vertical one, so I'm going to orient this one about so and probably put magnets on that. I don't think I can put them on this guy as well without having them attract each other and slam into each other and potentially move. So I'm just going to leave this one taped down and maybe press it down a little bit more as I airbrush around it. Now the stenciling from here will proceed very similarly to just using the background set. I'm going to start with the lightest color, the red first. But darn, it's looking speckly again. I think I hit my airflow regulator and it's too low. I'll just go over it a few times though, and that'll hopefully even it out, and then I'll turn up my airflow regulator for the rest of the colors. Now I didn't do this last time when I did the leaf, but here I'm using a masking piece to make sure I don't overflow the leaf in the back. And you'll notice it's very, very contained in that small area. My airbrush has a lot of control as well. Now onto the brown, again spraying lengthwise to avoid underspray under the long areas of the books. And I'm again spraying relatively close because this is detail work. I'm about 1 to 2 inches away from the stencil with low flow through the air regulator, about 1/4 of a turn from my closed position, and minimal pullback. I mean minimal pullback on the airbrush trigger because I don't want to release too much coloring. Now I'm on to shading effects. Here I'll be working at a greater distance, just as I did before. I'm going to shade it blue as I did last time. That's looking good. Now I'm just going to put the shading stencil down on the message area and mask off the other exposed areas of the cookie that I don't want to be shaded. And we'll use the blue again here. Again, spraying at a distance, and I'm just catching the edge here. I want to leave kind of a halo effect on the inside. And that looks nice. Just light suggestions of color behind both the message and the globe. Now back to detail work with the globe piece, just as we did before on the cookie that just used the background set. Spraying relatively close to the cookie with the brown, holding down with my trussing needle as I need to make sure spray doesn't go underneath. I'm going to repeat this exact same process with the frame that's going to go around the message, blocking off the exposed area of the cookie and weighting down my blocking pieces. And I like to move my trussing needle around the frame as I'm spraying just to make sure I get no underspray whatsoever. Perfect. Now the last step is back to the message. You want to choose one that fits your frame, of course. Once again, mask off the exposed areas of the cookie with my quadrant masking tool, or a piece of paper would work fine as well, and spray at close range. It's best to be gradual here in the application of color because in these tiny openings, coloring can pool on top and easily seep underneath. Lastly, some shading effects, applying the green again around the edges and a little around the leaf and the globe. And there's an example of the message and frame set and background and foreground sets used together. Of course, there are an infinite number of possibilities. You'll see many scrolling across the screen, and I'll show some as we conclude the video as well. But now I want to move forward and talk about how to create some dimensional effects using some of the same stencils, but a royal icing transfer technique. We're going to pipe the transfers first. So let's talk about these fun dimensional royal icing transfers using the same stencils, the poofy globe and the poofy apples. Basically, I'm going to be using my stencils to create a piping guide for royal icing. And we're going to first pipe a shape over the guide, then airbrush over it. This is a small apple. And then when it's all dry completely, we can peel it off and then place that separately on the cookie. I, of course, have done it with the bigger apple and also with the globe. Now I've created this tracing guide basically by airbrushing and stenciling the pieces I wanted to select and make dimensional onto paper. So the big apple, small apples, and globes, and I've just taped them to the perimeter of a cutting board so that it has some support and structure underneath, and then tape some acetate on top. We'll be piping directly on the acetate. You could also pipe directly on parchment paper, but for big transfers it tends to buckle more and misshape as the icing dries, and it's easier to see through the acetate. It just takes a little longer for things to dry on acetate. Now for these dimensional transfers, these are pretty big areas, so I want them to spread and be smooth at the end of the day with not a lot of track marks, but I also want them to have a little bit of body. So I don't want a completely runny icing. I want something that has a little bit of body to it. So I'm looking for it to basically plop off the spoon with a gentle shake. And any tracks that it leaves should disappear if I just tap them down with my trussing needle. So I think I've got the right consistency, but we'll just have to see. And for piping the transfers, I like to pipe somewhat within the guide so that when I stencil over them, the stencil completely encompasses the transfer. So I want to be just shy of the brown outline. I'm going to start by outlining it and then coming back and flooding immediately. I'll just do one big apple as an example, and then the globe. And I'm a little too far away from this edge, so I'm pushing it out a little bit as I flood it. Now my icing didn't quite meet the outline here, so I'm using the tip of my trussing needle to kind of tease it up into the outline so it becomes one continuous smooth piece of icing. So I just continue in this vein and fill out as many as I needed for my cookies. Obviously we can't stencil on these right away because they're wet, so they need to dry. You can dry them overnight. That's usually adequate because they're relatively thin. Or you can accelerate the process in a food dehydrator, and they might take 20 minutes to 30 minutes depending on the size of the transfer. But you don't really want to remove them from the acetate until after they're airbrushed, so try not to do that. Sometimes they will fall off just when they're super dry, but we'll try to leave them on because that way they're less likely to move around when we do stencil them. So here's a completely dry one. We'll at least stencil an apple and a globe in the next little segment. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do a mini apple transfer. The big one would be done exactly the same way. With my royal icing now dry but still on the acetate, I'm putting it onto a piece of paper towel, and then you want to lay the stencil on top of it so that it slightly extends beyond the area you piped. There's a little part of the top of the apple that you want to make sure gets on there so you see where the stem connects. So I might lay it a little lower than usual. And then you want to weight it down as always. So I weight down with magnets around it, as close to it as I can. And it's important to have the stencil completely encompass the icing so you don't get a little white edge because we're going to be spraying with red. So I'm going to do it kind of light and then give it a shadow by doing one side a little bit heavier. There she is, and at this point it's safe to remove her from the acetate. Now I'm going to do the globe. We're just going to swap out to some brown and do that in a similar way. I'm concentrating on just the countries, trying not to go over the edge on this one because I want the edge to be all blue. Now you need to give it some color as we had before, so let's go back to that green. And now I'm going to get my blue in here and we're going to hit the rest of it. And to keep your hand out of the spraying field, you can use your trussing needle to keep that from flying around before my hand was down there. I'm just going to hit the edges really pretty dark to highlight it. And then come a little bit lighter around the interior. So it's done. Now that it's done, it's safe to come out off the acetate, but oftentimes I like to leave it on if it doesn't pop off by itself, just so I have something to handle and I'm not having to touch the top of it to move it around. I want to lastly talk about one additional way to use stencils in untraditional ways. As I use them for piping guides for the royal icing transfers, I'm going to use them as a guide for dusting. And dusting is a dry-on-dry technique where I take a dry petal dust, a dry brush, and just kind of rub it into the cookie to give a soft highlight of color. And I do want to do it on this cookie that's to this point been airbrushed just to break up the swath of brown that runs through here. So I am using a compressed petal dust. I don't want too much color on here from Petal Crafts. And I'm going to use the Havana one, which is kind of a parchment yellow here. I'm using a very stiff brush for this. If it's too floppy, you're just not going to get enough color on there. And you might just want to test this on a cardboard or on a piece of paper towel first to make sure you don't have other stuff in your brush or on the palette that's going to change the color. And just rub it in. This is going to give these kind of a light parchment shade on all the pages and just add a little more interest to the cookie. I may not do it to all stacks. I might just do it to these two primary ones and leave some white on the edges just for some variation. Now you could airbrush into those areas as well, but chances are you'd get much more obvious color, and I wanted this to be very subtle here. And this dry on dry technique with compressed dust is perfect for that. And then you can brush off any extra dust. I'm going to try a darker color. So I've got a different brush that I typically use for darker colors. Just give it a slightly different blue shade through here. Okay, I think that looks great as it is, just using my background and foreground set as a reminder. You could, of course, embellish it further with borders, but what I'd like to do next is add one of the dimensional pieces that we just did, namely the globe. You wouldn't have had to fully stencil the cookie like this in order to know where to locate the globe. If you knew you're going to use a dimensional globe, you could have stenciled just to this point without any color, because you're going to be covering this whole area anyway, or you could have just left it completely blank, just left the area that the mask left behind it, because you know where you're going to place it in the context of the mask. But you just want to make sure in that scenario that you also capture the foot and the little arch that supports the globe with the airbrush. So to stick this down, this is nothing more than a gluing process. I've got a little bit of white royal icing glue, and I'm just going to cover this. That looked perfect, but what the heck, this will look even better and cuter. And you just want to make sure you don't handle the top. And I'm going to drop that into place. Now if I wanted to go crazy, I could add an apple on the top stack, which I might just do right here. And I want to really make sure I don't touch that because I left a fingerprint on it, the freshly airbrushed one. And just nudge that into place. And of course there are infinite possibilities of which I'm going to show you. Let me pull some of those forward. Once you've got the dimensional elements in place, you're going to want to finish them off, I think. More is more. So I added, in this particular rendition, little royal icing leaves piped with the number 349 Wilton tip, which is quite tiny, and a little apple stem in dark brown, which I just piped with a tiny, tiny opening in my parchment cone. I also added a few dots to accent the axis of the globe here and here, and of course the border. And that makes a beautiful cookie too. Again, just using the background foreground set here. There's no message here. And again, to demonstrate the versatility of these sets, you can combine them with the message and frame set, as I've done here. I've also got dimensional elements on this piece. The other cool thing about this one, despite the versatility of these sets, you don't have to stick within the bounds of the sets either. You can combine stencils from my other sets, my Prettier Plaques series, my Dynamic Duos series, and create custom backgrounds that work with any of the background, foreground elements, or messages in my school rules set. And this is just one example of that. The dot pattern comes from my Prettier Plaques monogram set, and the quatrefoil at the bottom comes from my Save the Date set. I merged the two to create a custom background. I show how to do that in another video, so jump on over there to see that. So again, there are a host of possibilities. They're nearly limitless, especially if you start mixing and matching across my sets as I've done here. If you're not familiar though with either of my series, either the Dynamic Duos that we featured here today or my Prettier Plaques series that came earlier, please do venture over to my stencil partner site, confectioncouturestencils.com. They've got my stencils and a whole host of other stencils as well. Until next video, live sweetly.